to make games. Ooh, I'll say it again for the recording. Hi, I'm Xalavier Nelson Jr. I'm a studio head over at Strange Scaffold, where we are constantly attempting to find ways to make games better, faster, cheaper, and healthier for the people who create them. I also have the fortune of being a narrative director and writer man, collaborating with studios across the industry on a whole bunch of different projects. Next slide, please.
Did it update?
Yes, it did. It did now. I've worked on over 60 games in the past 6 years, of which this is a very, very small number. Next slide. I was a journalist in a former life, including 2 years as a columnist for PC Gamer magazine. Next slide, please.
Wow, this game has some lag.
You can press next slide a couple more times. By the time it catches up, it'll all fit. I've done stuff for print. I've written for RPGs. I worked on comics, and in a former time, I would jet around the world, delivering talks and interactive experiences that were delightful, insightful, or ominous, depending on the circumstance and who you ask. That's me wearing a Jeff Goldblum picture as a mask. Next slide. This talk is called "Where Does Your Magic Lie?" because it's a question that I want you to keep in the back of your head throughout this entire thing, really, because it touches on the heart of the decision-making process, I feel, for not just games, but creativity in general. Next slide, please. I think a great place to start for this discussion is in the parable of Dead Rising. If you aren't familiar with the Dead Rising franchise, it is a semi-open world action-adventure series where you take absurd weapons, such as a teddy bear strapped to a machine gun, and use them to kill zombies and accomplish objectives in mundane environments. The first game, it's set in a mall, so you go to a sporting goods store, take a baseball bat off the rack, or just straight up a baseball, and you just start whacking zombies with it. So it combines this element of action and dark humor. It had 4 entries. The series is currently dead/dormant. And the reason for that, I believe, is in large part because at some point of the process, someone in the decision-making process, in the decision-making chain, didn't realize where the magic of that series lied. Because as the series went on, the veneer, the first game did really well, like really well. Second game did even better. And the second game introduced the ability to combine weapons in absurd ways to accomplish absurd things. And it produced things like that teddy bear. But the thing is, killing zombies in absurd ways, I'm using here a reference to the "This Is Not a Pipe" Magritte photo. That wasn't Dead Rising. But Dead Rising actually was the heart of that series, lived in its timer. In the first game and the second game, it had a very prominent timer that changed the way you interacted with everything, because it didn't live in your hands as you killed zombies. There's a bunch of things where you can kill things, and zombies in particular. It lived in the decision-making process and the improvisational thoughts and priorities you juggled as you were going through in that experience, because a survivor is calling you from across this Las Vegas-like environment. But there's another person over here, and that timer is about to run out, and you also have to get back to your daughter, because in 10 minutes exactly, she's going to need a dose of something that keeps her from transforming into a zombie. And you're constantly juggling those priorities in pursuit of greater market share and profitability. Starting with the third game, they deprioritized that timer. They said, this is what's going to get people to love the game. And oddly enough, it sold far less Then with the fourth game, they got rid of the timer entirely. And they made it a fully open world experience. And they brought it. There's a lot of clunky pieces with the Dead Rising series, some lovable, some not so much, some problematic, some gratefully not so much. And with that fourth entry and the third entry, as they took it more and more to attempt to reach parity and equality with other major tentpoles of the industry, they lost it. They lost their series. It went from selling millions to many millions with Dead Rising 2 and some millions with Dead Rising 3. And it didn't even clear 1 million with Dead Rising 4. The timer made the rest of the experience meaningful. The zombies and the absurd weapons were the veneer that all came together to create a larger experience. And next slide. This is where we run into an increasingly insidious issue with the industry at large. This is a screenshot from God of War, the new Call of Duty Vanguard, and Cyberpunk 2077. These are all great games, in my opinion, by very talented teams, very expensive games, but they're emblematic of an increasing factor that is ravaging the industry's ability to execute on large ideas, especially in a way that is not requiring crunch or that is cost effective and sustainable. And that is this idea of fidelity over everything, this idea of everything being good. And that sounds like a weird thing to say. Yeah, you want to make your thing good, right? But especially when you're doing a lot of things, making everything good comes at a brutal cost. Next slide. If you're making an open world game today, say something like Grand Theft Auto 5, one of the most invisible pieces of your experience, something that will still spend months, if not years of development time, is pedestrians, just the people who walk along the sidewalks. What do they look like? What are their hairstyles? How do they react to players? Do they react to players at all? Can they call the police if you do something wrong? Just the array of interactions that can come with not just visualizing those characters, but them existing in the world costs millions and millions of dollars. And that's just quietly invested by not just a person, but people across the studio. And that gets applied to making the shooting good, and the driving good, and the navigation good, and the flying good, and the playing of darts good. And if everything is just fine, why does anyone care? And perhaps even more pointedly, what do any of those elements have to say about the priority of the game? This comes to really bite content-heavy games in the butt, because if you have an RPG, like something like Skyrim, a large open world environment, again, open world games are a particularly good example of this type of syndrome. And it has a bunch of quests and characters you can interact with and items and weapons and stuff. And there's one thing that stands out. The way the human brain works is we see the thing that stands out or that is exceptional in quality as what should be the focus. And so you often get these conversations between players as the driving in X game was really, really good. Why wasn't that just the entire game? Because all the rest of what they're surrounded with is working overtime just to be fine, just to exist on a certain level. We can go to the next slide. And that brings me to something that has been going through my mind over and over again, especially as my projects become larger and my creative practice becomes more prolific, which is, did you know elements of a creative work can be bad? Did you know that sometimes a creative work can rely on a piece of it being bad? Not so bad it's good, but legitimately clunkiness, jankiness, a compromise here, a limitation here, even if it's not intentional, can do so much to communicate what a work is and what matters about it. And then at another step of meaning above that, if there's the space for it, what it's saying. And we can go to the next slide, which says, did you know you can make things that are bad on purpose? Like that isn't a bad thing. We say the word bad, we say the word negative, but when these negatives are used to communicate a greater artistic intent, they aren't bad anymore. They are a part of the thing that drives and imparts meaning to a creative work. Next slide. Elements of creative work deserve to be bad. To speak more pointedly to the people in this audience, whatever you're working on, we are constantly attempting to make the best thing we can be. And that is really important. I am constantly thinking about how I can make my things the best they can be. It haunts me. But if I want to truly make those things stand out in terms of their quality and in terms of their creative vision as much as possible, there are pieces of it that deserve, that need to be bad for the sake of my own sanity, for the sake of my team, and for the sake of communicating the full breadth of what that thing can be. Next slide, please. So within this context, gaining friction isn't necessarily a bad thing. This is Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator, a recent game we put out on PC and Xbox with Game Pass. It has, as you can see here, a scrolling list of things that are coming onto the market. And you can have opposing traders that are right alongside you trying to buy things, and they can snipe things out from under you. You were about to get that soul, but nope, a dog named Chad Shakespeare bought it instead. Fuck you. Can I say fuck? Good. Or someone buys a thing and you were about to click on getting a liver. You really needed a liver for a client, and whoops, now you bought, a heart instead, and you have to find a way to offload it, or maybe that caused a chain reaction somewhere in your cargo hold because things can interact in your cargo hold and everything's moving. And there are people who didn't like this mechanic in this way of interacting with the world. But as we found through much prototyping, without this essential friction, the game doesn't exist. You don't get to have the emotional or mechanical interactions with the world that are only possible if you have that little bit of friction. And the rest of the very finely tuned pieces of the world that are designed to be convenient work synergistically with that friction to hopefully communicate something more. Next slide, please. In this context, losing accessibility isn't necessarily a bad thing. This is a game we're working on right now called Witch Strandings, where you are a spirit of the forest in a Ghibli and Coraline inspired dark fantasy, physically transporting things with your mouse. You physically embody the spirit through your mouse. So you are navigating an open world, stepping through it, transporting things through it by clicking and dragging and carrying them to accomplish things that restore this place back to life, one intentional action at a time. We are not talking about too much right now, though it's very close to being complete because we got a publishing deal, very exciting stuff. We're gonna be able to talk about that partner soon. And that was a really interesting experience, pitching and finding the right partner for this game, because we would have conversations such as, hey, what about putting it on a controller or porting it to other consoles? Very natural for the highest profit possible. But the only way to deliver the things we managed to pull off in this game, things that long before it's even launched, like it had a giant feature on Kotaku saying, watch out, Kojima, there's someone else making a Strand game. This has a much smaller budget than Hideo Kojima, and we don't have Norman Reedus's tanned ass to sell our game, unlike Death Stranding. And yet here we are, being able to exist on a level of creative intention that only is possible by delivering something very unique. And we ended up finding a partner who understood this and supported that vision. Next slide. This is an airport for aliens currently run by dogs, and a perfect example of exactly what Colleen was talking about. This does not scream nuanced narrative and social commentary. It's stock photo dogs. It's a lot of it is tying into things like Adult Swim, and it's funny to see the evaluation of Adult Swim things over time, like Aqua Teen Hunger Force or Assy McGee, and other such examples of high culture, where at the time, no one was talking about, like, Adult Swim was for stoners. No one was talking about those like those were artistically valid pieces. But as time goes on, and we look at things like 12-Ounce Mouse, which is a Lynchian nightmare, as projected through a very, very low budget and a very weird thing, I have used it as a barometer. If I understand 12-Ounce Mouse, I have been up for too many hours and I go to sleep. So they were communicating very unexpectedly nuanced intention in a way that was not understood during their time of release, because they wore trash on their sleeve or simply didn't afford the ability to look any better. And with An Airport for Aliens Currently Run by Dogs, we ended up having a very, very finely crafted and lovingly rendered world with a very precise aesthetic and style guide to not make this all look like garbage. But at first glance, and especially in certain rooms, trying to talk to people about this game, like imagine pitching this game to a large platform holder, right? That's a very weird thing to talk about. This is going to be a meaningful and nuanced experience that isn't just a meme. And yet, folks ended up playing that game, whether it was for meme purposes or not, and finding that it was so much more than it looked, and that it could accomplish things that would not be possible if we had finely rendered 3D dogs and made a drastically more expensive game to get to a place that was less than where we ended up. Next slide, please. When we embrace intentional flaws, limitations, and compromises, it carries a risk of being misunderstood, of being not taken seriously, of rejecting pieces of a potential audience or the market. But it also carries an incredible opportunity, not just in terms of your creative practice, but in terms of sales. So much of what we take for granted in terms of a game or a movie or a piece of music that sells and reach people is founded on things that are arbitrary. Someone did it once. We're like people who, upon seeing that silent movies sell, be like, why would you add sound? People love silent movies. Why would you do that? We have the ability to reach customers. If we want to be speaking in a very crass and commercial sense, we have the ability to reach customers that cannot be reached through any other way, and create things that have never existed before, only through committing to artistic visions, even in ways that may be counterintuitive or rejected by the audience that isn't for that work. Next slide, please. And this is where it's important to talk about the ideals through which we pursue this limitation. I think that the ideal for intentional limitation is communication. If we have a whole set of like style guides and ways in which we reject the audience, but it does nothing to create a human connection with that audience, then we did all of that performance for ourselves. We have such a finite time on this earth in which to make art, in which to be able to pay our rent, and also in which to impact the human beings who experience our works. Communicating intention and having a creative intention and vision without turning it into a point of communication with the audience is lost for everyone involved. So the way I think about this is the ideal limitation or flaw or so-called compromise presents an idea, it evokes a question from the audience, and it answers that question in a unique and compelling manner. So for Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator, organs, capitalism, hello. The question naturally is, why? Why did you do this? And the answer that we have been so relieved to find has landed whether it was a member of the press or whether it was a streamer or just someone playing the game by themselves and ultimately interacting with us and letting us know about their experience, was, oh, holy crap. Because of how our brains work and because of how capitalism works, as soon as you attach a price tag to something, whether it was, an antique or a literal human soul in a storefront, I saw it as a commodity. I was asking like, oh, stomachs are down today. And then going like, why, that isn't normal. Why did I say that? Why did I say that out loud? My partners in the room, they think I'm crazy. I'm just going through the exact same thought process that is applied to every area of our lives. That's a moment in which we've connected the team behind the game, the marvelous team, because it wasn't just me. Everyone committed to and found ways to further this vision in their own discipline, take this intention further. And as a result, we have all these ways that we can connect to people on a human level. Please advance the next slide. And that brings me to something that really frustrates me about this deep emphasis on fidelity over everything, which is that so much of that is produced from fear. It's a monologue. It is driving in your open world game so that people don't criticize you or claim that you are lazy or wrong because you didn't have driving. It is quietly pursuing the idea that if I do it good enough, and if I have enough of these things in one place, you'll see me. You'll like me. Maybe you'll hear what I'm saying somewhere else. I say we choose conversation. I encourage you to choose conversation. And I encourage you that if it makes sense, and if it supports your creative intention, you look at where your magic lies. And if you need it, you make something bad on purpose. Thank you so much. And that is it for me. There's a last little slide thing where you can, hit me up about questions, comments, concerns, or whether I'm horribly wrong. I'm not, but you can send the message.
Oh, Xalavier, the market for hearts is way up over here. I just got to say thank you so much for, I think, speaking to a group of folks. Most of the folks here are embarking on thesis projects or major studio projects. And I would say there's a lot of fear with that process, right? You're putting yourself out there, and the ability to choose bad to is really interesting. And so I guess my first question, it's really about how, oh God, I've got 100 questions here. So when you talk about that, the idea, right? The thing that you try to get coming through, right? When you made Airport for Aliens, currently run by dogs, for instance, and you have like the stock photo dogs. The game is not, it's deeply rich and it's kind of a beautiful, I don't want to give it away, but there's like this real kind of deep heart stuff in there. And I feel like in all of your games, there's a really bizarre, strange world building that kind of occurs and that you're experiencing, which is really exciting and wonderful. But that underneath it all, there's this real kind of deepness in terms of emotion and feeling. So where does that come from? And how, when you're pitching a game like the airport game, do you actually talk about that? Because I feel like as a player, that slowly is revealed. It takes time. You've got to spend time with it. So I'm just really interested, especially for folks who are trying to present their work, how you get to that part for folks.
I think a lot of that human heart comes from a point where at its core, I see myself as a commercial artist. I am very much focused on our creative intent and purpose or whatever, but for how I personally wish to pursue, for example, eating as a human being, I am excited by and actively pursue what that creative practice looks like in a commercial context, selling things to people and delivering experiences in a marketplace. And with that in mind, I'd say a big part of how that heart exists and why it comes through is because I see those things as not working against each other, but working together. I could make the simple dog game that is like burr, burr, and is exactly what it looks on the surface. But going back to something I said earlier, I've got a tiny amount of time on this earth in a cosmic scale, and you've got a tiny amount of time that you're giving me. You're just giving me like your money. You're giving me your time. You're going to play this game. If I am to only deliver the most shallow surface level of what our decisions result in, not only does it make those decisions land much less with much less impact, or not land at all, it's also this missed opportunity to have a direct connection with you as a viewer. And when we talk about pitching those games, to the detriment sometimes, I've had some very interesting talks with other developers about that. We just put that up front. Like from the beginning of An Airport for Aliens Curling Run by Dogs, we were telling publishers and platform holders, here's what all of this works towards. And that means that you don't get the pithy one sentence pitch. You do have that still, but if the entire point of your pitch is to deliver what your limitation is, why you chose this idiosyncratic thing, and how it will make it connect more with your viewers, knowing what that thing is and saying this is what the effect it's going to have. There's a lot of people who they're looking for something that is that shallow level understanding. There's just as many people, I'm convinced, if not more so, if not more people, who are interested for that story, that greater story and what it can deliver. And I'm convinced that that's a big part of the reason why, of the things I've been very grateful for as a developer, we haven't really lacked for coverage, because we are making so clear at every layer of the process that our creative visions are more than the joke on the outside, or the reference or game that they're supposedly inspired by.
Mm-hmm.
People want to talk to us all the time, and our stuff gets attention. For that, I'm both eternally grateful, and I cannot place it. I cannot explain it by anything more than, that we make that a critical story, part of the story of the game.
Yeah. I had a follow-up question to that, which I'm not going to ask because there's some other questions coming through, but maybe I'll ask it really short, and you can think about it in the back of your head while you're answering other questions. I know you can multitask like that. Your beginning as someone who wrote about games, then wrote in games, and then started designing games. I feel like as a progression, there's something there that really helped you kind of manage that commercial end of the business, right? And like how you actually pitch and describe things. But that's more of a comment on kind of how I've seen your work evolve, and maybe you have something to say about that. But let's go with Ted, because Ted, your background, first of all, I want the lighting kit you've got.
Thanks, Colleen. Hit me up on Twitter. I'll tell you every piece of kit in this dumb room. I'd rather hear Colleen continue to ask questions, but I'll just ask a small one, or rather, first off, thank you, because what a fantastic topic. For the last 4 years, I haven't been making games. I've been consulting people on how to make their games as strong as possible from a technical but also design standpoint. And you see this time and again, the reticence to cut away features that you're going to spend a lot of time on, and that the game itself, from a technical standpoint, also has to spend a lot of time on, that really end up hurting the things that are strong, the magic, as it were, whether that's, whether your game is really about the aesthetics, or it's about one amazing mechanic, or one limitation you put in that like just helps to drive and give purpose to that gameplay, and they don't cut it off. So I hope some folks see this. I hope this circulates and goes around. I did want to ask you what your opinion is on a game on the opposite side of the spectrum that has been hammered by its audience, and which I feel expressed its limitations, which is I spent most of the weekend playing the latest Pokemon game. And it's being torn apart for visuals. It's being torn apart for, they got rid of EVs, they got rid of gyms, everything. And I played through it. I've been a Pokemon player since, like a lot of folks that are older here, since, Red and Blue, and and watch that system evolve and become more and more complex, right? And it's been great, but like I can't breathe for the life of me. I can't compete for the life of me. I played this game, and yeah, they added a little bit of open world stuff, and that's new and fresh, but they did it in such a beautiful, unobtrusive way that I'm like, oh, cool, I'm still catching Pokemon. I'm still fighting Pokemon. Everything is beautiful. And like, why are the graphics simple? Well, because that way I can actually see Pokemon in the field and objects in the field. Great, that makes sense. Why are all the evolution and EVs nonsense so simplified? Because they weren't that fun. They were very complex.
Ted, you're answering your question.
No, but what are your thoughts? Sorry, I'm answering my own question. How you I saw you gesticulate, so I'd love to hear your take.
So I'm gonna answer by talking about another Nintendo exclusive that came out recently, which is Monster Hunter Rise. And for those who aren't familiar with the Monster Hunter series, it was quite niche for a long time. And then it was they released Monster Hunter World, and it took the traditional, very focused and sometimes abrasive loop of Monster Hunter, which is go out, fight monsters with your friends, take off little pieces of them, like, cut off a big monster's tail with like a poisonous tail, and then make super cool poisonous tail armor. Yeah, fashion. And it put that in a very high fidelity open world context. And everybody's like, oh man, Monster Hunter World 2, right? No. They made Monster Hunter World for us dumbasses who say that is what a big and meaningful game has to be. And then they went back with Monster Hunter Rise and said, but you know what's even better than fidelity? Intention. So Monster Hunter World was in one big, large open world map, and all the creatures had so many interactions, and there was a very small set of creatures as a result. New Monster Hunter, so many creatures, so many monsters. They're adding more like nearly every week, like new missions and stuff. And it's not open world anymore. It's got very large zones, but they are focused zones that communicate something very precise and specific. And the world is, you come to your base, you do interesting things there, you prepare, you go out, you fight the monster, and you come back. And that loop is compulsive, and that loop is where Monster Hunter always lived. It's made friendlier than ever in Monster Hunter Rise. But that focus, people are asking why it's there. And it's because they can, have the commercial success to say, this is where our game lives, and we aren't going to go away from that. So in a similar way, to bring it back to your question, with Pokemon Legends Arceus, whatever, with Pokemon Legends, they've done this very interesting thing of saying, what is a Pokemon game? You're catching Pokemon. You're interacting. Pokemon are fascinating inherently to see behave in the world. So here's a game about preparing, catching them, building up relationships with them, and evolving that through the course of a story. It is a brilliant move. It is exactly what the series needed. And every time Nintendo rejects the thing of like, what you need to do is make the graphics like 4K, and then does this instead and sells 14 million copies, maybe hopefully eventually we'll realize that that's for a really important reason.
Excellent. And yeah, that's I think the point that I got out of this, which is I hope this is really valuable to folks who are, setting out on their own pitches, but I also hope this carries forward with them throughout the industry as they get into places that are making these massive titles, and they can be the voice of reason of like, hey, what are we doing? Because we're diluting the heck out of what makes our experiences meaningful.
It's a trap. It's a straight up a trap. And Colleen, you had a thing you wanted to bring up.
No, I was just going to say, it's interesting. Richard has asked a really compelling question because one of the things about the program is that not everybody's making games. And I would imagine, I have to think, let's see, we've got some amazing alumni. We've got Robert Yang, we've got Zach Gage, we've got people who are out there, Kaho Abe, making wild fashion wearable tech games. But I think that the bigger question is really about this idea and how it can be applied to other areas as well. So Richard was asking that one. I don't know.
I have a very brief addressal of this, and it's very simply minimalism.
Right.
I don't know what half of the fucking icons do on my phone anymore, because at some point we decided everything had to be monochromatic and smooth. I've seen some screenshots from Windows XP recently, and I forgot how legible it was, how much I understood what was going on and what everything meant. I think for, whereas in games, the trap is fidelity, for other disciplines, a very easy thing to find is what is an idea that is universally applied. For UI UX, it's been minimalism, and users are suffering as a result of it.
Nice. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. What is the idea universally applied, and how do you actually kind of break those patterns that don't actually communicate what they need to communicate, right? So it's all about the conversation. So Beatrice has asked a question here. I can read it for the folks who are listening. Xalavier, thinking on references, where do you get inspiration for your stories? I understand there's this side of a version of the mainstream industry, but do you have a game that was major to influence your current writing and narrative style?
I try to pull in for inspiration from everything is the realistic but not super helpful answer. So yeah, Space World Organ Training Simulator was partially inspired by a doctor's visit in which a man not in hospital scrubs walked in as I was waiting to be checked on for my checkup and said, "Do you want to see your insides?" And the thought went through my head, okay, this is going to end very badly, or I'm going to get a really cool story out of it. And I said, yeah, let's do it. And it turns out the dude was a doctor in training. He needed practice on the ultrasound machine, and I got to see my liver working and my heart working, and there was and my lungs breathe. And these things are working inside of us all the time, but we sometimes painstakingly attempt to not think about it. And directly confronting that was a really important thing for that game. So the more you can read, listen to music. I've had entire games, things that I spent years of my life on, inspired by singular pieces of songs, just pieces of songs, like the first 30 seconds, and then I don't care about the rest. The more you can take micro experiences and things that you find in art that you don't even like, the more you can experience as a breadth of intake, the more, I believe, rich your output will be as well.
Beatrice, was that the answer you were, or was that the question you meant?
Not the answer I was expecting, but the answer I needed, LOL.
Yeah, exactly. Was very good.
Awesome. We've got a question also from Giannis. I don't know, I guess, Beatrice, I'm sorry, I read your question, but Giannis, do you want to read your question or speak it yourself?
Sure. My question is about game addiction. And do you think the designers are complicit, or the more addictive a game is, the more successful, like the more kudos the designer should receive? And finally, do you have any advice on how to deal and cope with game addiction?
There's a lot of potential questions within there and a lot of territory to cover, but I think speaking about like limitations and compromises and how that relates to addiction, it's been really interesting to see as both the games industry and as a wider culture leaned into engagement and the ideas of constantly coming back to the same things. There's been also a rejection of that, which is part of why Wordle took off in the way that it did, because it was something that you did for 5 minutes and then felt bad about because you're a writer, but you don't know enough 5-letter words. I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about you right now. So Wordle being this thing that in a thing where even your mental health app gives you a daily login bonus, had no reward except for engaging with the thing itself, became a core piece of its story. There is a MMO that is exploding right now called Final Fantasy 14, and it's been around for a while. I fell in love with it. Part of the reason I fell in love with it is because the creators are often giving interviews saying, we can't expect every MMO or every game to attempt to take the primary place in people's lives, because they have families and jobs, and we need to make games that work around those people. And that game became so popular with its most recent expansion that they had to take it off of sale for over a month. Don't come in, we have enough players, because people are looking for not so much addiction, but for varying ways of engagement. And then there's also gonna be the people who they want to play Destiny every day. There's a wide tent of experiences, which is another reason to avoid universal rules and so-called adequacy, which is really in a lot of times mediocrity and there's just like, we can call it mediocrity of pursuing the latest trend, means that this very, very wide range of experiences, which people are very open to, it means you fight for that tiny sliver that is right now identified as valuable. So that's the main thing that I take away from that question relating to the theme. Does that answer what you were looking for?
Well, and any successful ways to actually get rid of, like, are there any routines or regimens that you would recommend so that one doesn't go into the spiral of addiction, or if they do, to know how to break away from it?
I'll be honest, that isn't something I can give a whole bunch of experience on myself.
Yeah, I think that you brought up a really interesting thing about also a lot of the compulsion of like apps that ask you to check every day. We call it like a toothbrush app, right? In UI UX, it's like, well, what's the reason for the user to go back every day without questioning that why that is good? Why is that actually necessary? Munis has a question. Munis, do you want to speak it or?
All right. Hi, first of all, thank you for the talk. And I'm just wondering, like, I love some games that feels like a journey, and they're such amazing experiences that I couldn't really describe it other than telling other people just to play it. However, I don't normally play them again because I've already had that experience when I played it the first time. So I was wondering that if replayable is something that you also consider when you're designing like very experience-focused games. Are there other ways to design games even though they're experience-focused, but then people still want to play again and again?
I think the honest answer here is that it depends on the project. One thing I do like a lot is a project that has a finite beginning and end, but has a wide enough breadth of experiences you can have within it, or a compelling enough game loop that you can come in after the story is done and continue to engage with it. But yeah, like replayability, that's one of the things that's seemingly mandatory, especially as time goes on. And depending on your intention of what the game needs to hit creatively and commercially, that's how, at least at Strange Scaffold, we decide whether or not a thing should be replayable. If a thing being replayable is going to harm the experience that it delivers along the way, then we take great pains to either separate off the replayable bit into, actually, this should be its own game, or maybe a part of the main game, or ditch it entirely. Because if we don't deliver the main thing, the reason you're here, to the utmost of our ability, and to the utmost of what it could be, then you're not going to stick around for the 400 hours of gameplay that we spent 2 years designing.
Yeah, that's an amazing answer. Thank you.
And then we've got a question from Nell about minimalism.
Hi, so the question I had was, how do you balance the clear benefits of minimalism and making things really usable, efficient, etc., and balancing the downsides of minimalism that you mentioned, like making things harder to understand? The example I was thinking of was, you mentioned minimalism was a negative today in icons, as they don't really represent what they actually are. So it's kind of like a balance between dirty design and the obsession with like clean, minimal design today.
And I think a good example of this is things like text list design. I would like to know what the gear means, please. Does that mean settings? Does that mean you're going to make a little vroom vroom sound on my phone? I don't know. And I think, yeah, as minimalism taking not just the idea, I think the idea of minimalism, I really like the idea of staying out of the way of the core of the experience and finding the most defined, rendered down way to deliver something. But I also just want to know what something means. And minimalism usually goes like all the way in terms of like no text, all symbols. It looks like this. That means it's the dance part of the app. What? So with that in mind, the way we balance minimalism as far as the creative practice at Games that Shrink Scaffold, and what I talk with others about when I do consulting or an air design on other projects, is what does minimalism give you? What is the specific type of minimalism that you're looking for? Because sometimes you want a textless design. You don't necessarily want like so-called minimal icons. All you want, what you really mean by minimal, is we don't want text here because we want to deliver something specific. And I think that's the big point that I take from minimalism in particular, which is for any given universal rule or design element, that's usually not one thing. It's a big set of things that are then used as a stamp to define all these experiences. So the more you can take that large monolith, separate it out into its pieces, and choose which pieces specifically benefit the vision of your project, the better the results, and also often the better your project becomes, because that practice of identifying the individual elements and seeing which ones fit in helped you understand your project better in the process.
Amazing. And Richard was just talking about how you use the term friction. I was really curious about that too, because I think when you think about it from a UI perspective, right, you're talking about making it harder to do something. Is that kind of how you meant that, Xalavier, or were you talking a little bit about the emotional quality of like seeing stuff happen that's messing you up? I guess they both are the same.
I wouldn't say that they're necessarily the same. There's a lot of interesting things that are suggested by friction, and friction doesn't seem like, again, like a positive word. Like the word bad is a bad word, but I use it for emotional effect. The term friction is very interesting because it is a natural result of something else. Friction does not exist in a vacuum. There's nothing interacting in a vacuum. Friction is when there's two or more elements that are having a conflict, or rather just an interaction. So the idea of when I talk about friction, and this has been interesting because I did like some Twitter threads about it, and it went like lightly viral, and I had to be like, no, please, our game is not designed to hurt you or for you to hate it. It's designed to, in very specific ways, have interactions that may conflict with what you want or what you think you want to deliver something specific.
And would you say that when you were playtesting that, it sounds to me like players were complaining about it. They were like, I don't like this. Let me collect my organs without that added complexity. Or was like, how do you actually read that when you're playtesting? Because I think for a lot of students, they would initially be like, oh no, I have to take that part out. make it smoother.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm thankful that I have not just really good collaborators, but just, yeah, that I'm not a monolith in myself,
Mhm.
which is when I'm like 3 a.m. brain, we need to get the game out the door. Here's this bad feedback. It's punched me in the face. Okay, we got to fix it. And they're like, no, it doesn't work anymore if we change this. There's a lot of times I'm the voice of reason in that room, but there's, especially near the end of a project, when I'm in a very highly strung state. I'm very fortunate to have people in my life who push back and say that a project, that the experience needs it, or that something is reduced when we alter it. So the direct answer to your question is, the absolute best thing you can do as a creator is know yourself and know your project. From those two things, everything else emerges, and everything else must be evaluated. Because it would be very easy. We didn't actually get, during our playtesting, we actually didn't get that feedback much. It was after we released it to a larger audience that we got like hints here and there of people who didn't like it. And those negative things stood out so much that even like invisibly we could see, oh, here's all these players who it makes the experience work for them. If you know your project and can either internally build up the strength or have people to hold you back from the brink in that dire moment, allow you to commit to that thing, and that's really important. My cognition just like fell off at the very end there, but I hope you understand what that is.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, know yourself as a creator. Know that maybe at the end, at the 3 a.m. brain, you're going to have doubts and the negative comments will seem so much bigger than the positive. And know your project. Heck yeah. I think those are great words of advice for us to close tonight's session with. Xalavier, thank you so much. This has been inspiring, and I'm just really thrilled you could join us tonight. And yeah, I hope you can come back somehow, somewhere. End of the year, we'll be showing all the work. So we'll certainly send you an invite to that. Thank you so much, Xalavier. This is really awesome.
It has been a delight. Thank you.
Woohoo! Richard, thank you for organizing this.
And changing the slides. You were a champion.
It's my special skill. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Awesome.
Bye, folks.
Thank
Hey,
you.